It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, newsbreakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Andrew Buchanan is a senior lecturer in the History Department at the University of Vermont. In his recent talk on campus titled The Holocaust and the Long Second World War, he explains that as pivotal as the war years of 1941 to 1945 were, what happened before, and more importantly, what did and didn't happen afterward, are also crucial to understanding world politics today. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, Buchanan also discusses why European Jews were targeted and how anti-Semitism remains prevalent today. I began by asking Buchanan what prompted his interest to study World War II.
Well, that's a big question. I guess I would say couple of different things. I was born in 58, so just 13 years after the end of the war. So the war was very present in my life growing up. Family members and teachers, and the town I grew up in, a small town in the south of England, had been bombed during the war. You could still see there were still bomb sites that we played in as kids. So the war had a very direct sort of presence. I grew up with, my parents were historians, so I grew up in a house full of books and discussion of history, so that kind of fed into it as well. And then when I went to college to study history, I think the World War II really became central to what I was interested in because of its formative character in shaping the contemporary world. So that was really my sort of interest in it from that point of view. So I mean, I'm plenty interested in the operational stuff, in the strategic stuff, in the more military side of it. But the things I'm really more interested in is the sort of social, political, economic framework of it all from a global point of view, really. That's what I've focused most of my actual research and writing on, different aspects of that.
In the recent talk you gave, you talked about how World War II, for me as an American, I think of it as being starting on December 7th, 1941 and ending in 1945, but that's hardly the case. Yeah,
and I've had the good fortune to be, both myself and with colleagues that I've worked on around the world on this, been very much involved in sort of rethinking the time frame. You know, all of us are shaped by the countries we grow up in, the educations we receive in those countries. When your country rules the world or is the most powerful country in the world, that has a particular weight in shaping that outlook and the sort of attitudes that are often attached to that. So I've tried to sort of think about and advance a different timeline, which really is really the product of the Great Depression in the 1930s and sees the war as a sort of process of responses to the Great Depression, so something that really starts right in the early 1930s, particularly with the Japanese, the decision of the Japanese to respond, of Japanese elites to respond to the crisis of the Great Depression by seeking to expand their territorial control and within that their access to economic resources, coal, iron, etc. in Manchuria, beginning in 1931. So I've sort of pegged the start of when I say the start of the war, it's really to think about it as a series of wars that overlap and combine in a certain way. Because clearly something does happen on December 7th, 1941. Right. And the consequences...
A day that will live in infamy.
A day that will live in infamy, and a day that brings the United States formally speaking, into the war in a direct way. And the United States is the only country that had both the capacity and the political desire to fight a genuinely global war. I mean, you could argue that the British fight in both the European theatre and also in what they describe as the Far East, but the British war in Asia was a very defensive war that they really did not have the resources to fight simultaneously with the war in Europe, whereas the United States, of course, has the capacity to do both. And I think what becomes increasingly clear as historians have studied it and dug into it in more depth is it also had a desire and will to do that, which was connected to taking advantage of the opportunity of this series of global conflicts to really reorganize the world and establish a new world economic and political order. Whatever one's assessment of the project of liberal internationalism, that clearly that is the goal at least from the summer of 1940. So thinking about that central aspect of the war from December 41 to September 1945, when the Japanese surrender, as the sort of central core of actually what's a much longer process, longer at the front end, the war in China that I've just been describing, or the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, or even the German wars of expansion, or campaigns of expansion in Czechoslovakia and so on, before the formal start of the war. But also to thinking about what happens after 1945, which is a tougher sell in many ways. The dropping of the atomic bomb seems so final that it's actually kind of hard to get people, to persuade people to think beyond that. But when you look at what happens in the immediate aftermath of the war, the rebellions for national independence in Indochina and Indonesia, Malaya, Burma, the process that concludes with the formal independence of India in 1947, the Chinese Revolution in 1949. I mean, an event just literally 4 years after the formal end of the war. It seems to me to discuss that without integrating that into the history of quote unquote the war is really, really difficult. So sort of expanding the time frame, not just at the front end, but also in terms of conclusion, I think has been really, really, really helpful to helping people see it as a broader process rather than as a sort of thing.
Not to mention the creation of Israel.
Yeah,
in 1948.
Not to mention the creation of Israel in 1948, and in fact the reordering of the Middle East more broadly, of which that was a piece, including, for example, the overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran in 1953. It's very much part of how the turmoil and flux of the war years understood in that longer framework finally gets consolidated into something that one could say is really a sort of new order. I mean, obviously that has its own instabilities and its own issues and stuff, but there is a moment, it seems to me, that the turmoil of the longer war years does get consolidated, and yeah, absolutely. From several different points of view, actually, the formation of Israel is very much a piece of that. Yeah.
Now go back. You talk about the Depression. I think many people are not necessarily aware that the Depression was worldwide. It wasn't just the United States.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true, and I mean that's worth thinking about as well in terms of what's not established at the end of World War I, that World War I does not result in a new reorganization of the world, a new world order in that sense. And it's in many ways, I think, that fact and the instabilities that come from that fact that means that when the crash happened, when the Wall Street crash happens in October 29, that radiates out around the world in this very rapid way, and of course the wave of actual industrial downturn that follows hard on its heels also is really worldwide. So, for example, in Japan, which had really been integrated into global capitalist markets after World War I in a sort of tendentious way, but real, and the forces within Japan that favoured trade, that favoured collaboration with the United States in that sense, that favoured, in a certain sense, modernity, liberalism, political liberalism, had the best part of a decade of being in the driving seat, and yet when the crash happens, it's not hard for other forces to say, well, this was always an illusion. You're never going to get a Fed. We need to find our own way. We need to have our own autarkic project. We need an expansionist policy into Manchuria, into China. So it's absolutely directly connected to the impact of the Depression. And that's true that's certainly true in Germany.
Do you argue that World War II is a product of that depression, and that depression in part in Germany?
Yeah, for sure. That the world system that's put together at the end, or that emerges from World War I, basically is going to crack sharpest and most profoundly at its weakest links. So that the stabilization of Germany after World War I had been weaker. The economic recovery had been more conditional. The depth of political crisis in Germany had been more profound. I think it's often forgotten that in that sense that Germany's not defeated in World War I. That the Imperial German government is overthrown by a domestic revolution, which in many ways was an attempt to emulate the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. So, how profound an experience that was shaped the character of the Weimar Republic and its relative weakness from that point of view. So the impact of the Great Depression was sharper and deeper in Germany, and therefore both on the left and the right, the prospect of more radical solutions was posed in Germany in a way that it wasn't necessarily posed in some of the other major countries. Although if you look at France, I mean, there's major waves of politically motivated strikes. There's the rise of powerful fascist-type movements. I mean, this wasn't just Germany. It's just that the German experience, for various reasons, was the most profound in that sense.
Why were the Jews the target of feeling that the Depression was that they caused the Depression?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, obviously, and a super important one. It built on, really centuries of anti-Semitic prejudice in Europe, which had its roots in a completely different social system, in medieval feudalism, basically, and the specific role of Jewish bankers and moneylenders within that framework. Which, of course, was not to suggest that most Jews were bankers and moneylenders. They weren't. But in Western Europe, those classes, those forces had a particular influence and weight, and of course generated their activities generated resentment and hostility and prejudice, which was legitimized by the Catholic Church in all kinds of ways, and so medieval European history is studded with its own histories of pogroms and expulsions to start off with. So that's sort of there's a sort of bedrock of that sentiment. But certainly, when you get into the conditions of the Depression, I think it's hard to find a precise way to explain this, because in a sort of simple way, we tend to equate anti-Semitism and racism, and obviously there's some similar modes of expression and modes of thinking that are connected, that are associated both with racism and anti-Semitism. But it seems to me that racism fundamentally exists to divide different groups of working people against each other on grounds of skin color or of ethnic origin or perception of those things, and therefore has a sort of objective function of pitting different groups of working people against each other. Anti-Semitism has a slightly different character, which it tends to substitute anger against a capitalist ruling class for anger and resentment of a particular group of people who can kind of stand in for or substitute for a capitalist ruling class as a whole, which obviously has tremendous utility from the point of view of let's say, German capitalists, right? Ethnic German capitalists who can say, it's not us that's causing the problem, right. It's these other people who, as we all know, they argue, are cosmopolitans, are not nationalists, have no loyalty to Germany. They're more loyal to each other. There's a conspiracy of them around the world. And guess what? The communists are also led by Jews, and they're also cosmopolitan and anti-national and internationalist and have no loyalty to any given country. So those two things kind of merge together in a really, really powerful way to turn anger and resentment against the real consequences of the Depression into hostility to Jews and to a rise of anti-Semitism. I mean, I wasn't going to say much about contemporary politics, but I mean, the fact that you can see a rise of anti-Semitism in the world today, I mean, you can just chart it statistically on the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and Britain and other, advanced capitalist countries. I think is totally to do with resentments and anger and frustration that's generated by the real economic conditions of life for working people in those countries. I don't say that to justify it, obviously, but I think to think about and explain it. I think there's been a long-term decline in racism in this country. I think if you think back to the kinds of things that we might have said and thought when we were 10 or 12 years old, no 12-year-old in this country thinks like that today. It's a marker of just how profound that shift has been, and yet anti-Semitism moves by a different set of pressures, I think, and so you could have that on the rise while racism. Anti-black racism or anti-immigrant racism. I'm not saying those things have gone away. That would be obviously completely foolish and naive, but have decreased.
One of the things that you talked about that I thought was interesting was how the anti-Semitism moved from pushing Jewish people away to then it became extermination. Mm-hmm. And can you talk a little bit about that shift in thinking?
Yeah, so we're talking about within Nazi Germany here. Yeah, I mean, the initial sort of goal of the Nazis is basically to create a Germany that's free of Jews, but essentially by driving. I mean, it's a violent process. It's not a peaceful process, and the rise to power of the Nazis was marked by anti-Semitic violence on a substantial scale, but not by genocide. There wasn't a systematic attempt to kill Jews. There was a systematic attempt once the Nazis take power to drive Jews out of the country, to deprive them of jobs in the civil servants or the government administration or the military or the professions, to attack their businesses, to take businesses away from them, and to generally make their conditions of life increasingly unbearable in the hope that they would choose to leave. And of course, many do. I mean, not the vast majority, but a substantial majority of German Jews between 1933 and the time that the Nazis finally closed the borders as the European War begins in 1939. So in that 6-year period, a substantial majority of German Jews do leave. It's only after the war begins that, as the Germans move into Poland, that they find a substantial Jewish population. I mean, very significant Jewish population, which they have no interest in simply expelling. So the genocidal impulse really begins with that, and then of course extends as they advance into Ukraine and Belarus and the Baltic states at the start of the war with the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. So there really is a transition there into systematic genocide, and even that's there's a gradations of that. I mean, we tend to think about the Holocaust as the camps, and that is truly the sort of central horror of it. But certainly in Ukraine, Belarus, other parts of what becomes Germany's Eastern Front, very large numbers of Jews are killed immediately after the arrival of the German army through special forces, special death squads. They describe it as genocide by bullet or Holocaust by bullet. People just marched out of their villages, forced to dig their own graves and executed. There's not many villages and small towns across that entire region. One historian recently described as the bloodlands of Eastern Europe that doesn't have some site of that sort associated with it. And this is all before we get to the industrial scale extermination, which really doesn't. The decision for that is probably taken in the summer or early fall of 1941, but it doesn't really get going until early months of 42. So yeah, I think I mean part of what I've been sort of thinking about in this lecture, this project is thinking about how does the Holocaust fit into that sort of longer time frame of World War II that I've been discussing with you. So how do we think about the Holocaust before genocide, and how do we think about the what unfolds afterwards? Because equally, it's not something that comes to a screeching halt as the Allied troops arrive at the death camps and liberate the camps. The suffering of Europe's Jews does not end at that moment.
Let's actually talk about that, because I thought that was a really fascinating part of your discussion. I mean, I think you even said at one point there was nowhere where the Jews were welcome. Mm-hmm. I mean, and even in the United States, Harry Truman actively tried to limit the number of Jews. Argentina, Brazil, Canada. I mean, the list went on and on. Why, after we had this sort of euphoria, as you describe it, of feeling great about having liberated the camps, were the Jews then not welcome anywhere?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a deep question. And I think, first of all, as you say, just the simple facts of the matter it's a Canadian top immigration official who's asked how many Jews would Canada accept, and says 0 would be too many.
And that's just not what we think of Canada today.
It's totally not. But of course, it did conform to the policy before the war, which of shutting the doors of Britain, the United States, and many other countries to Jews trying to flee, as we were moving into that period of the intensification of the Holocaust in Germany. So I think that the American elites, British elites, I mean, they were more genteel about it, they were more mannered about it, but there's no question in my mind that they shared many of the same kind of ideological frameworks. I mean, it was on another subject, but come across interviews with Roosevelt where he just basically argues that Jews in Germany kind of bring it on themselves. They're overrepresented in the professions they generate. They should realize that their own behavior generates hostility and so on. And so those kind of ideas. And if you think about as I say, it's more mannered, but the exclusion of Jews from country clubs and the informal but very well-known quotas on the number of Jews who are going to get into elite institutions and those kinds of things. I mean, this is very deep. It's deeply embedded, and precisely in times of crisis, it came to the fore. And I think we tend to, looking back on it, because it's been such a convenient argument to sort of to formulate that war was somehow about this question, and it wasn't. From the point of view of America, Britain, the other major, it was not widely known amongst the American public until the final stages of the war. It was not seen as. In fact, they deliberately refrained from countering, from vocalizing the question of opposition to anti-Semitism as a major war aim, ostensibly because they're concerned that will, that will undermine support for the war amongst their own populations. So, once you start seeing it like that, then I think that the continued exclusionary policies after the war are not so surprising, but they're still really shocking. That even when the US does agree to admit more refugees, the quotas are deliberately set up to privilege Baltic, Balts, Poles, others above Jews, and it's really quite explicit and really quite shocking. Same for sure in Britain. They use this very twisted logic in Britain where they say that if we start admitting Jews to Britain in large numbers, it will prove that Hitler's claim that about creating a Jewish-free Europe was sort of justified because we'd be helping to do that sort of idea, right? Which is so crazy.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So what was World War II about then? Another small question.
Another small question. Another small question. Well, I think in the first instance, it was about, or let's say the overlapping series of wars that produced World War II were about the struggle of the German, Italian, and Japanese elites, essentially, who all felt for various reasons that they'd got a raw deal after World War I, in carving out I describe as autarkic blocks, as self-sufficient economic empires, contiguous with their territory. So the Italians in the Mediterranean, the Germans in Eastern Europe, the Japanese in Manchuria, and then in China. So that destabilization of the global balance of power, obviously a direct challenge to the British, to the French empires, which were the main sort of global structures at the time. But in the course of that, opening an opportunity for the United States to begin to very consciously set out to I say take advantage, it's not really a moral question, but just to use this crisis basically
to fill the vacuum,
and to create to participate in the defeat of Germany, to lead the struggle to defeat Germany and Japan and Italy. But the goal was not to return to the pre-war status quo. The goal was to establish a new world order.
Yeah.
When I'm teaching this, the publisher, influential publisher Henry Luce writes in February 1941 his famous article on the American century, and it remains a stunning piece to this day of a vision of the war as the opening to a new. It's so difficult to say New World Order because it has a sort of Germanic, has a Nazi feel to it. And I'm not making an equivalence then in any sort of.
Well, it's also a phrase that's been used by American presidents.
Yeah,
more recently than we'd want to think.
Yeah, and that question, right? So but it is what it is, and I think when you dig into it a little bit, what's striking is how conscious that is amongst the sort of State Department people, military leaders. There's a whole slew of kind of Ivy League think tanks, what we might say policy wonk type of people who really put this together. And it's very quick. I mean, it goes in response to the fall of France in the summer of 1940. It really goes from we sort of got to hunker down in the Western Hemisphere to this is the opportunity to. And for a lot of them, it's thinking about what they'd hoped to get out of World War I and didn't. So sort of revisiting an opportunity to revisit that. So and that shapes up very, very quickly. And once it's there, it's a powerful idea.
Because to go against it is to be almost. Whether if you're in America, that's un-American somehow.
Yeah, and it's and it's quite a switch, right? Because it means that it suddenly to be an isolation, quote unquote isolationist,
right.
Which actually not that many people called themselves at the time. It was really a phrase that was used to sort of paint opponents into, to tie your opponents. Being an American was about assuming the responsibilities of world leadership, policing the world in various ways, organizing the economic structure of the world, organizing the political structure of the world. It's not coincidental that the United Nations is founded here, is headquartered in all of those kind of things, and that all shapes up very quickly as I say, really in the summer and fall of 1940 as they adjust to the new opportunities, which Roosevelt is very much at the center of.
Let's go back to
Sure.
too, though, because I think we ought to point out it was not only the Germans who were anti-Semitic before and during the war. I mean, there were a number of other countries in Europe that were equally, atrocious.
Yeah, no, well, in outlook, yeah. In what they actually were able to do about it, no. I mean, there's a comparative question, but there's also a specificity to the Holocaust, which is
extermination camps.
Which is unique.
Yeah,
but
fair enough.
But you can look at the Italian fascists don't really start by making a big deal out of anti-Semitism. In fact, in the early years of that Italian fascism, Jews are actually involved in the fascist party, but at a certain point from 1938 onwards, it becomes much more central. You have a great wave of anti-Semitism in France, for sure. You have fascist sort of emulators in Britain. It's very central to the ideology of the Franco and the nationalists in Spain. It has significant weight in Romania. In other parts of the Balkans, and you see it in the United States. I mean, you don't really have a mass fascist movement in the United States, but you have a whole series of sort of claimants to the fascist mantle here in the 1930s.
Well, you talk about Father
Coughlin. Yeah.
I mean, who was quite influential.
Yeah, I mean, his radio show is listened to. It has millions of listeners, so it's a message it's broadcast. It's a widespread message. So,
yeah, at one point I think he was described as being the second most influential voice in America after Roosevelt.
Yeah. I mean, those things are always hard to quantify, but he's a significant figure. He's a significant voice in that sense, a significant political pole of attraction. Had the economic crisis in the United States unfolded differently, had it had greater severity, had the New Deal not at least headed off the most severe aspects of the crisis, it's by no means out of the unimaginable to think about a section of the American elites actually turning to support these kind of forces as they did in Germany and obviously in Italy. So it's very easy to sort of naturalize this in Germany, but no, it's much broader. And ironically, from a certain point of view, it's also pretty powerful in Soviet politics. After the rise of Stalin in the late 20s and the sort of turning inwardness of what had been the revolutionary internationalism of the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, anti-Semitism is prominent in Soviet politics. And the same kind of accusations of cosmopolitans and disloyal and Trotsky's a Jew, and it's very prevalent, yeah, for sure.
We'll continue our discussion with UVM's Andrew Buchanan right after this. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Back to our discussion with World War II expert Andrew Buchanan. And I know present day politics is a bit of a minefield, but at the same time, when you talk about how the Jewish population really had nowhere to go after the war, the number of countries that just rejected them leads to the creation of the State of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And seems as though that's a situation, it's a controversy that's still playing out today.
Yeah, no, for sure, and I think that I think there's a tendency when we don't really think about those processes to see Jewish migration to British ruled Palestine as some kind of a settler colonial project or something like that, without really looking at the fact that, as you point out, for people sitting in the displaced persons camps in Europe, which were horrible places to be, and you have no other prospect, then that becomes the migration to Palestine becomes a very attractive proposal. So even for people who are not, deeply committed Zionists in that sense, the attraction of the project through lack of alternatives in many cases, I think, becomes really powerful. Yeah.
How was this where Israel is today chosen? How was that selected? Why was it there in the middle of the Middle East as opposed to Argentina, Canada, or somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Jewish diaspora historically came from what's today the region of Palestine, Lebanon, the east coast of the Mediterranean. That was the historic homeland. So as Zionism begins as a political project, mostly in response to anti-Semitic pogroms in Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, in the late 1800s, that's really the driving force. Although its political leaders tended to come from the West, that's another question. Yeah, the place that they identified with as a homeland was that. So I don't think for most Jews who migrated there, it began as an idea that we were going to go and dispossess Arabs, or this was about hostility. That was not their mind. Their mindset.
They were going home.
They were going home. Yeah, they were going home. Obviously that turns out to be a lot more problematic and have a lot more other questions related to it than they might have imagined. But that sense, I think, is absolutely real, and in many parts of in cities like Haifa, for example, Jews and Arabs had lived together. I don't say always in perfect harmony, but had lived together for hundreds of years, as had Hindus and Muslims in India. It's what was inflamed there in the course of the British manipulation of the decolonization of India to try and exploit those divisions to create a situation that would be more easily dominated essentially by the Western governments. It really wasn't what the history of India had been for the previous couple of hundred years. Mm-hmm. So what tends to often get presented to us as sort of quote unquote age-old ethnic hatreds kind of idea are often much more recent constructions and manipulations. And in the context of the Middle East, a chunk of that comes from the Arab elites, many of whom had been put in power by the British in the aftermath of World War I, and were very exploitative, essentially landlord type regimes of the Arab peasants, of the Arab peasantry there. So for them, anti-Semitism also had a role of diverting the anger and frustration of lower class Arabs, Arab peasants, Arab workers, away from hostility to their own ruling classes and against the Jews. So in that sense, I think it had a very similar function to the function we were discussing in Western Europe earlier. I mean, it's a parallel phenomenon which the Germans recognized and worked on during the war. So Nazi propaganda was crafted for the Arab world, broadcast to the Arab world. Arab leaders, at least, collaborated directly with the Nazis. This was all real. but it really has this character of these Arab regimes. So I'm talking about Transjordan, I'm talking about Syria, I'm talking about Iraq, I'm talking about Egypt, successfully diverting attention away from their own injustices and towards Jews, that anger and frustration.
History repeating itself.
Yeah, in lots of ways. And their own behaviour was disgraceful in lots. I mean, they do not. I mean, if you look at Lebanon, you look at Jordan, Palestinian refugees were not integrated into those populations. They were kept separate. That issue was deliberately kept alive as in the so-called refugee camps, which became basically cities. That you weren't going to become Jordanians or Lebanese or Syrians. And seeing that as a consequence or as a connected element in that longer world war, I think is really important. That the war had its consequences in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, as we might say now, which we tend not to look at. It's we tend to focus on the European war in Western Europe. We tend to focus on the war in the Pacific. We tend not to look at the Mediterranean very much, or the Middle East very much, or even China, or Southeast Asia. Considering how much is written and published and films are made and how much material there is on World War II, it's sort of the unevenness of the treatment is really, really striking.
And it seems too, what I'm hearing is that we make the mistake in looking at this almost as chapters. So there's a chapter that talks about German involvement. There's a chapter that talks about Japan. There's a chapter that talks about the Holocaust, and that really, they're sort of the long arc of history that starts in the Depression, that goes through the first, Second World War, and even is even going on today. I mean, what's happening today, it feels, and not just today, but really for the last 40 plus years in the Middle East, is a consequence of all these decisions that were made back then. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And that we should be looking at it as more like a time continuum as opposed to these defined chapter 12, chapter 13.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. Having said that, I think that thinking about time frames is helpful at a certain level, because it enables us to organize the thinking about the processes into a form that's comprehensible. Otherwise, everything's dissolved into everything, right? It just becomes a whole, and so from that point of view, for example, I do think that the global political crisis and military crisis that begins in the early 30s in response to the Depression is resolved by the early 50s, by the end of the Korean War, the Chinese Revolution, the establishment of Israel. You could cite a whole bunch of the partition of Europe between the Soviets and the US, the beginnings of the sustained economic recovery after the war. I mean, those are. It doesn't mean everything's resolved. I mean, if you're Vietnamese, I mean, you can argue that your war is pretty much continuous right through until 1975. I mean, it ebbs and flows, but for most places, there's a degree of stability which helps us to separate the periods a little bit. So I guess I'm arguing sort of for longer chapters and more inclusive chapters rather than for no chapters at all.
Why do you think it's important for people to understand that World War II is not just, and I'll spare you my FDR imitation, it was not December 7th, 1941 to 1945? Why is that important for us to understand?
Because it's so what we're talking about here in terms of the world order And when I say that, I mean both its strengths and its weaknesses that emerges from World War II did form the entire global history of the second half of the 20th century and continues in many ways to inform what happens in the world in the early 21st century. I think we're living in a period in which that global order is unraveling, actually unraveling at an accelerating pace. But if you don't really know what the order was or where it came from, the unraveling is it's hard to really get a handle on that. So I think for anyone who's interested in world politics today, having a grounding in this is really critical. And I kind of think everyone should be interested in world politics today. So I mean, these are huge questions.
How is it unraveling today, in your view? Or I guess changing, maybe, is a better... But you use the word unraveling.
Yeah, no, it's unraveling. It's unraveling. There's a number of different aspects to that. I think you have to start with thinking about, just to take one example, the American decision at the end of the war to rebuild the economies of Western Europe and Japan. So the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. And the reorganization and basically rebooting of the Japanese economy, which were completely correct decisions from their point of view at that time. That was how the global capitalist economy, with the United States at its center, entered into a protracted period of economic expansion, essentially from the late 40s through to the early 70s.
Right.
But it had consequences, which is that the German economy was rebuilt with more modern machinery, more modern plant. The Japanese likewise, with different senses of labor discipline, and therefore different levels of profitability than was being generated by business in the United States. As a result, by the 70s, the US starts to face severe competition.
Yep.
I mean, there was a time when you would not see a Japanese car on the roads of the United States, right? I mean, it just wasn't a thing. And then it is a thing as that competition mounts. I'm not arguing for the exclusion of it, far from it, but that just to show the weakening of the weakening of the profitability of American business.
Yep.
As a consequence of its decisions, which, as I say, were the correct decisions from its own point of view at the time, but there's a price to pay down the road. The consequence of the fact that the United States, the biggest hole in American global order at the end of the war is China. The major place which they're unable to get a grip on at the end of the war is China. Partly as a result of strategic decisions that the US took in how to fight the war with Japan, partly because at the end of the war, there's a gigantic mutiny of American soldiers who basically demand to go home in late 1945, early 1946, of citizen soldiers who basically say, we signed up to defeat Germany and Japan, we've done that. We're not going to China. We're not going to, it's time for us to go home. And it's incredibly powerful. The consequence of all of that is, while the US is extremely powerful at the level of nuclear weapons, air power, sea power, it's not able to send a military force to support its allies, its nationalist allies in China. As a consequence, within, as I said earlier, within 4 years by October 49, the Chinese communists are in power. So if you think, as I do, that one of the major goals from Washington's point of view of the Pacific War was dominance in the Chinese market, that's turned out really, really badly within just a few years. And again, I don't say that to prettify the Maoist regime or so. I'm just looking at the reality. The reality.
Yeah.
Which means that China then embarks on a completely different pattern of development. And by the late 70s or early 80s, okay, what happens then? The Americans are losing their competitive edge. how do they try and respond to that? By investing in low-cost markets, low-wage labor markets overseas. So the beginnings of the gigantic offshoring of American investment. And lo and behold, a big bunch of that's going to be in Shanghai and on the coast of China.
Yep.
And we have Nixon and all the rest of it paving the reintegration of China, the road towards the reintegration of China into the global market. Well, it's however one evaluates it politically, whatever your feelings about it, it operates by very different laws. It has much bigger state sector. It's highly organized, energetic, dynamic. I mean, if you just look at the creation of the railroad system in China, for example, those kinds of measures, inevitably that's going to lead to increasing tension with the United States. So on all of those kinds of measures, you start to see unraveling or the coming apart. I'm not predicting this is going to be all, this is a process we're talking about. We're early stages of the process.
But you're right. I lived down in Springfield, Vermont, which was the machine tool capital of the world in many respects. There were 3 manufacturers down there that made machine tool parts that the community was virtually wiped out by Japanese competition. And again, that's not a judgment. It's just I would, as a reporter, call every Friday to the 3 major manufacturers in town to find out not if there were layoffs, but how many were laid off. And these were high-paying jobs. These were good jobs. They came with good benefits. And if you go down and look at Springfield, Vermont today, it is still suffering the consequences of what happened in the early 80s.
Yeah, and I think there's a generation of students now who to imagine the U.S. as the productive heart of the global economy is a real challenge. I mean, just to think about that, right? The major producer of automobiles, of refrigerators, of radio sets, of all kinds of consumer goods here in the United States, right? That's a huge transformation that's taken place along those kinds of lines. It's not that there's less people in the world doing the kinds of jobs those folks in Springfield did.
Right.
It's just that they're not in Springfield.
Right.
Which
has domestic political consequences. Economic.
Has consequences in a global capitalist world. It has huge consequences. So I think. If you're a really powerful hegemonic power, global dominant power, you have to have a big military force, but you really try and avoid using it too often. I mean, it's just the presence of it is usually significant, is usually adequate to get your way. Clearly, that's less and less true. That the U.S. military, I mean, we are becoming normalized to the U.S. military being intervening militarily. And usually not with great consequence. I mean, it's stunning. It is stunning that a 20-odd-year war in Afghanistan leads to one of the weakest, most underdeveloped countries on the face of the planet, leads to an ignominious American withdrawal at the end of the day. I don't say you have to keep adding disclaimers. I don't say that to glorify the Taliban or something like that, but just to look at the facts of the matter. So I think the likelihood of military confrontation is higher now today. Is it going to be in the Taiwan Straits? Is it going to be in the South China Sea, or is it going to be someplace we don't even anticipate? But those are signs of the weakening of the global order, the order that was put together at the end of the war. It seems to me. In that sense, I kind of think we're in a pre-war world rather than a post-war world. If you think about the analogy of the long World War II, where we're more towards the 1930, 1931 end of that today. It seems to me. I'm not trying to make a prediction of how. I'm just looking at the general tendencies of developments.
Well, and I've been talking about this with other guests and with people I know, and I look at the American economy today, and it feels a little bit more like the Gilded Era, moving into the number of people that are living in downtown Burlington outside, the drug addiction problems, but really more just people who are working full-time jobs, unable to afford housing. I mean, there seems to be an economic stratification that is not unprecedented in this country. Mm-hmm. And do you find that concerning?
Yeah, and I've no doubt the observation is accurate on that. Yeah, I think there's a deepening social polarization, class polarization in the United States today that's going to have all kinds of political expression and political consequences. Yeah.
I know you're a historian. You're supposed to look back, but
I'm going to look back.
But I can't help but ask you. Well, let me ask it this way: how worried are you that history is going to repeat itself in whatever way it's going to repeat itself?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, when you say we're in a pre-war situation, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, what chessboard are you looking at? Who are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think history ever actually repeats itself in some sort of cyclical kind of a way. But I think there's things that we can see and identify as processes in history which reassert themselves with vigor in a different period. And I think we are. I mean, I think that the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States today, which I think is real, is a reflection of of precisely these kinds of questions. So that the question of scapegoating, people who you can be convinced are some kind of conspiracy behind all of this, those kinds of ideas get credence in this sort of political period, it seems to me. And you hear the language, you hear it when people, and see, here's the thing. We often kind of think, or people often kind of think that we're talking about something that comes out of the right wing of politics. But that's not necessarily true historically. I mean, people across the world who adopted virulently anti-Semitic views in the 30s, some of them came from the left wing in politics. I mean, Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists, had been one of the most prominent leaders of the left wing of the British Labour Party. Benito Mussolini was on the left wing of the Italian Socialist Party. I mean, it was their frustrations that turned in an anti-Semitic direction to change society. So it gives it this sort of. I mean, I use it in the talk, and a German socialist in the 19th century referred to anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools, and I think it's a great term, right? Because it's like you can't, if you're frustrated in your capacity to actually transform society in a progressive direction, then the attractiveness of things that seem to explain why this is so. In sort of conspiratorial terms, and it has greater weight, has greater attractiveness. So I think we're seeing that today, and as I say, I don't think it's just out of the right wing in politics. So all of those things, I think, in some degree, are analogies to things that happened in the response to the Great Depression. I mean, obviously, we don't face a depression in quite such a clearly demarcated way that begins with a very distinct stock market crash and so on and so forth. But
that we know of.
Well,
yet.
yeah,
Right.
and even in the if you think of the continual inflation of these speculative bubbles, whether it's the .com boom or the cryptocurrency boom and all of this stuff, right? It all has that character of trying to short circuit actual organization of production, and to find some get-rich-quick scheme that works around and outside of that, and that's very that's a big feature of the contemporary economy. So, yeah, there's an analogy with the stock market crash. It doesn't have to be, it's going to, the market's going to lose 50% of its value overnight, and that's how we'll know. No, it's not a repeat. But the crisis and the fragility of the financial sector is always a reflection of deeper and more systemic problems, and I think that is what you see today. And so your point about for workers, that you can be working, not just you can be working a couple of jobs and still not have enough to, the declining birth rates. Why? Why don't people want to bring children? Why do they not want to have children? Because you can't afford it. You don't have the financial stability to be able to confidently think you can do that. So these become huge questions. I think they're accumulating, irrespective of the outcome of the next general election in the United States. However that may go, none of this is going to be. None of this is going to be resolved.
Well, and that's not going to change the amount of debt that this country has taken on, what it costs to go to even your university. I mean, I think that's one of the major factors that people take into consideration. It's, raising a child, what the cost of raising a child. Then you think about things like $60,000, $70,000 a year for a year at college, times 4 and times 2 or 3 kids. I mean, people, when you and I were growing up, a family of 4 or 5 was not unusual. Mm-hmm. That seems unusual now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure, and all the associated crises in healthcare and other sectors of society that are vital to people's well-being, for sure. So all of that accumulates. All of that, and the sense of how have we got to this? How that idea, right? That can go in my opinion, can go in that's an inquiry that can go in a deeply progressive direction, or it's an inquiry that can be directed towards these kind of conspiracies of which anti-Semitism retains substantial force. I mean, you listen to the kind of things people say around George Soros, right? I mean, I have no love for George Soros, but the kind of explanations of the conspiracy or the Davros meetings, and they're all code words. They're all codes. So yeah, that's very profound. And so the question that you raised earlier about the place of Israel, right, of which has more than half the world's Jews live in Israel, right? It is seen as a sanctuary. Whatever else people might think about it, that question, it's profound. I think it's interesting because it's often termed that the idea that Palestine was partitioned, but it really wasn't partitioned, because the partition plan was not acted upon, which actually resulted in at the end of the first Arab-Israeli war in a substantially expanded Israel. So the basis of having an actual two-state solution, of two viable, independent, in some kind of mutual, non-destructive, mutual relationship, we're a long way from that right now, unfortunately.
What are you hopeful about? Let's end here on maybe something positive. What are you hopeful about? Is there anything in technology, in economics, in the social interaction that we have that says to you, wow, this is such an improvement over what we had during the Second World War, the period after, the period before, that you say to yourself, I'm hopeful about humankind and hopeful about the earth?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I am very hopeful. I mean, it probably doesn't sound like it from all the stuff we've been talking about, but I think that fundamentally, most people, most of the time, want to find ways of working with other people together collectively to make things better. I think that you see a real revival in the United States in the trade union movement. I don't want to exaggerate that, but it's real. I think you see a development of thinking and consciousness on other social questions. It was really striking to me that when there was the big oil train spilt in East Palestine, people who probably had not spent a lot of time thinking about the environment before that are suddenly, and for good reason, find themselves in alliance with environmentalists about those kind of questions to really try and do something about those situations. I think people have an understanding of the commonality of humanity around the world, which was not true. It was not true in my youth, for absolute sure. Which I think creates the sort of sensibility on which real human solidarity can be built. I think collectively human beings have got the capacity to solve all of these problems. I mean, you can't solve the climate crisis in terms of turning the clock back, but humanity has the capacity to collectively organize and mitigate the worst, to manage it, as human beings have always found ways of doing. So, I'm not pessimist from that point of view. The crises that are going to unfold, it's in the nature of crises that they are also moments of opportunity for different solutions to become possible. The outcome of that, it depends on what decisions people choose, how they choose to organize. I mean, none of it's a given. We've got a lot collectively that we can accomplish, it seems to me, and I've been hopeful about that my entire life. I remain hopeful about it.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. Thanks for listening.